Hi, Tyler. I'm Sarah from The Upcoming.
Well, pleasure to meet you, Sarah.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Hmm.
Maybe you can just kick off with a brief intro. Tell us a bit about Robin's Wish.
Wow. It's a film that I think seeks to shed some light on Robin Williams' legacy. I think it's a misreporting that happened at the end of his life, and we finally discovered what actually happened to him. So it's one of these things that I think it really changes the legacy of one of the most famous people and one of the most gifted entertainers of all time, who also was like kind of a certified genius. So the idea that this disease that you'll learn about in the film affected his mind, I think is a really powerful sort of look into, sort of your greatest gift being attacked by something medical and realizing how fragile we all are, and that Robin was not above that.
And maybe you can tell us a bit about the genesis of this project, because I understand Susan originally came to you wanting to focus more sort of tightly on the disease itself, the Lewy Body Dementia. And then it sort of came to this idea of actually including, this narrative that people didn't know about, this last year and a half of his life that they spent together, where, the symptoms of this disease were obviously starting to show themselves, unbeknownst to them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so, once exactly everything you said happened, Susan and I set out on this process of trying to understand what her story was. And this was only like a year and a half to 2 years after Robin had passed that we started doing this project. So the idea that I then had to go and kind of verify all of the things that she laid out to me, because I would have held nothing against her as a widow if she would have got some details wrong, was really powerful. And then the process of bringing in 16 other people who loved and knew Robin very well, who speak and contribute their own stories. And then I think what you have is this beautiful record of not only who Robin was in a way that I think I hadn't seen, powerfully to me, I hadn't seen in a celebrity bio kind of pick where you kind of learn about a celebrity. These are people who really knew him. He lived in a suburb, basically, which is so strange that Robin, like a mega celebrity who could have lived like up a mile-long driveway with a guard, like that he lived in a little cul-de-sac in a suburb, and that all of his neighbors knew him. They knew him very well. Like he knew their kids. Like they walked dogs together. Like and that all those people form this really clear narrative about what the last year and a half of his life was like, from people who saw into his world in a way that other celebrities or people might not have. And then that we have people from his working life like David E. Kelley and Sean Levy, who come forward and kind of reveal some incredible things about what happened on some of those film sets at the end of his career in terms of his cognitive decline, like the amount of memory loss, the amount of inability to sort of perform, and that they all kept that secret for years. I was really I thought that was powerful, that like Hollywood has this ability and this sort of like this societal thing that they do in where they cloister, right? Like they'll keep secrets for 40 years. And the idea that they came out from behind that and really risked their reputations. And Sean Levy and David E. Kelley are fairly big Hollywood heavyweights. When I went to David E. Kelley's office, I think he had like 30 Emmys behind him. I mean, the idea that kind of guy was willing to say, I'm willing to put myself at risk for my friend Robin, so that people can know the truth. That became a big responsibility for me, and something I think we did well by in terms of the film.
And how do you decide kind of what mix of things to kind of put in the documentary? Because it is an interesting balance between these talking heads, focusing quite a lot on, the dementia and the science side of things. But then these brilliant clips that you've obviously dug through the archives and taken bits from when he was younger, doing stand-up, doing the voiceover for the genie and Aladdin. So how did you decide to kind of, get that mix? And what was it like going back and I guess kind of digging out these gems of his comedy?
Oh, so fun. I mean, that was the thing that you can't lose sight of. So when you're doing a documentary about Robin Williams and you have this like incredible insight into what happened at the end of his life that no one's ever been able to know before, and people are revealing these incredible truths that like were like completely only ever revealed in this film. Like no one else has even touched on these things, right? Like that's so exciting. But you cannot forget, you cannot like set aside that Robin was a generational talent. He was one of the most, sort of powerful and beautiful entertainers that maybe has ever lived. And the idea of being able to include pieces of his work to sort of add to this narrative, like anything that's in the film. There's a beautiful sequence from when they were doing the Aladdin voiceovers. And Robin over 2 days created that character out of thin air, essentially, right? Like all of the improv and all of the, and it gives you this real sense of his genius, right? His ability to create at the highest level. And then we all, of course, like, you know, emotionally go, oh my God, yeah, the genie. But then you have other things like the Dead Poets Society in the film, and moments where he's just improving with his friends on stage, because that's another big piece of it, is like his comedy was really rooted in his sense of play, right? Like he wanted to sort of just have fun, and that was who he was. And it wasn't an act, and it wasn't something he would put on. Like it gave him great joy to not only be on stage, but also to do that with other people and to be of service in that way. So the way that we chose the archival that's in the film is really, it had to be twofold, because there's so much great Robin Williams. You had to say, okay, it's great Robin Williams, and it's touching on this theme that we care about, or it's sort of showing the side of him that we think people need to see in this moment. But there was no shortage of incredible Robin Williams footage that we had to choose from, and that was a really fun process to say, like, oh my God, like how do we even begin to understand what's in the movie?
Did you even have a temptation, like, oh, actually I could just make a whole other documentary just focusing on like all the work he did, and maybe bits that people don't know about, and, you know, the mixture of comedy and actually very serious, some quite dark films that he did, like 1 Hour Photo or whatever?
Oh yeah, 1 Hour Photo. And he did that great thriller with Al Pacino where they're like in Alaska and he's the murderer. No, but like that was so in this age where every documentary gets broken out into 4 parts now. And like there was a world where we were like, oh yeah, we could, you know, but it just became so clear to me that it was really about that central thing that we could offer an audience that no one else could, which was that we had this truth, and it was all to be in service to that. But yes, I'm deeply fascinated by his work. I became more so once I understood who he was as a human, like the service that he gave to the military, the way he would sit with wounded soldiers and kind of do it without any PR around. Like he wanted to just go and be of service, and that was really who this guy was. It gave me a real sense of, wow, I want to go rewatch all of his stuff and understand, like, man, like he's just such a beautiful human. And you had this thing in the film that's also revealed that I love, which is this note that he wrote to himself near the end of his life, but he was just laying in bed and he was thinking about, you know, what do I want to be and where do I want to go with the rest of my years? And he wrote, I want to help people be less afraid. Right. And it's like, he could have written anything. He could have written like, I want to get back to doing blockbusters. You know, I want to start a garden. But he was like, I want to help people be less afraid. And that to me was really powerful in the way that I looked at that as a reflection of who he was before that moment and who he'd always been. All of his movies for me growing up were powerful, right? And the idea that like they were all helping me be a little less afraid. I'd go into the world that he was giving me, and it would take away whatever my worries were for the day. And that, like, that's the power of film. That's the power of art. And that he deeply understood that and cared about it was like, I think that was a really powerful moment for me as just a fan of his, as going through the process of making this film.
And there's a lot of focus, you know, especially from Susan, and I think, you know, throughout the whole documentary, of wanting to kind of undo, you might say, like this tainting of his legacy. And so why do you think it is so important? How does it change how we reflect on such an amazing person as Robin Williams, to understand actually what was going on? And, you know, maybe it liberates us to kind of cherish him in a different way that had been somehow pushed to the side by this, you know, the way the media covered it when he did pass.
That's a great question. So, I mean, I would say that when he passed, he didn't have the diagnosis of Lewy Body Dementia, which he had like one of the most advanced cases they'd ever seen. And, you know, medical doctors said that basically at the end of his life, he had the mind of like a 5-year-old, right? It really diminished who he was and what he was able to do or even conceive of. So without that, you know, journalists were left on the day he died to sort of guess at what it had been. And they said, yeah, maybe he ran out of money, maybe he was depressed, maybe he was back on drugs, all of these things. And it gets to this larger point, which is something that I think we all think about, which is on our most difficult day, the way we react to those difficulties, to that challenge, it defines us. Like the way we are in the hardest of times is who we really are. And I think the story was done poorly, unfortunately, because, you know, the truth hadn't come out yet. It didn't come out until the autopsy, which was, you know, months after Robin's passing. That he actually didn't kind of fold under the pressure, and he wasn't this dark personality, which is sort of the way that they were saying, well, you know, if he committed suicide, maybe he was not up to the task, maybe he'd faltered in a place where he shouldn't have. But actually what you find is he was completely absolved of basically any ability to have even gotten himself out of that situation because of the amount of brain damage he'd suffered by that point. And the idea that up until that point, he stayed compassionate, he stayed generous, he stayed kind, even to the point where the last night that he's alive, we have in the film of him going to a neighbor's house and just kind of asking for a hug and wanting to talk to the guy. Like, this is not someone who passed from this world angry or sad, or, you know, like he was understanding on some level. I like to think, right, we can never really medically know, but I like to think that he left this world with a sense of like, I don't know what is happening to me, and I don't think I can go on because it's becoming harder and harder every day. And the idea that his mental abilities weren't there enough for him to be able to talk himself out of that anymore, that's such a different picture than someone who was just a dark personality. And that kind of thing makes me get really excited about tapping back into who he really was as a fan, as someone who cared about his work. And it makes me want to just go put on The Birdcage or Mrs. Doubtfire or Aladdin or any of these, like Hook, right? Like, just to go back and watch his films again and go, oh, that is who he really was. That whatever special person he was on screen, the person in real life was better. I think that's something this film hopefully does a really good job of showing, is that the person he was in his personal life was better, more rich, more generous, more kind, more varied, more soulful than any of his performances on screen. And it only makes sense, right? You can only get 10% of yourself on screen. Like, the idea that the other 90% was so rich and so beautiful, and that all of his friends attest to that, I think is it's a really powerful moment for someone who had a bad turn at the end of his life, especially in the way that it was understood by people who cared about him, like you or me or any of his other sort of admirers.
And so in that sense, even though it does focus on something that is, you know, very challenging about the way he did pass, it actually has that hopeful bent to it, because maybe it will make viewers want to go back and rediscover everything they love about this person, rather than it being something that they had to kind of somehow put to the back of their minds because they didn't really know how to deal with the information they've been fed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the thing that's so beautiful about the film is you understand who he really was. And it does, I think, honestly, I played some role as the director of the film, but really it's the 17 people who come forward who knew and loved him that say, yes, Robin struggled at the end of his life, but he stayed loyal, generous, kind. He stayed the person we knew and loved. He just fell prey to something that could have happened to anyone. And it happens to 1.4 million people a year, and it's incurable, it's untreatable. And that's just such a different story than was given to people at the time he passed, that I really think it does fundamentally change it. And it brings you back to understanding, of course, someone who can give the world so much joy and so much ability to feel would have been a beautiful person. It makes less sense that any of the previous reporting was true, and this makes so much more sense. And I think that's something really powerful and clarifying, that like it made me feel lighter, just as someone who didn't understand what happened to him in the end. And I've had friends who've watched it and they're sort of like, oh wow, like, yeah, I do want to go watch like Good Will Hunting or a Good Morning Vietnam, or, you know, like I do want to go, yeah, let me connect with Robin again, because like that is the work that he left us all with. He left us this beautiful treasure trove of gifts that we can access at any point now. And like I think that does right by him and his legacy. And you know, I hope it's something that would have brought him some joy to know that like that this has come full circle that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm out of time, but thank you so much for sharing all that with me, and, you know, for this brilliant film, which I think absolutely, well, like you say, really does make you remember and go back and reflect on what an incredible legacy he has actually left behind. So thank you so much for the film.
Oh, my pleasure, completely.
All right. Thanks, Tyler.